Okay, so Thomas Jefferson on religious freedom. This obviously has some important historical resonance and significance and influence over debates about church and state in the state of Virginia. But also a lot of these ideas really underlay the First Amendment and the ideas about why freedom of speech, why freedom of expression, and of course, freedom of religion are so important, okay? So there are a couple of things, a couple of readings in your course packet. One of them is from the only book Jefferson wrote, Notes on the State of Virginia. The other is from a short piece of legislation that he drafted on religious freedom. And again, this is specifically relevant to religious freedom, and that's really what he was concerned about in the moment, in his historical moment, when he was trying to argue for greater freedom of religion in the laws and so on of his time. But all of these ideas about how free exchange of ideas, how truth works, how error works, how government, I don't want to say interference, but also support for correct ideas, moderation of the public sphere and what's being said might work, okay? So speaking specifically, again, we'll see how this is so relevant to all kinds of ideas about the First Amendment, about freedom of speech, expression. A lot of these things are kind of combined or summed up or captured in the idea of freedom of conscience, okay? And that is, of course, the right to believe what you think is true. And the idea is, so what Jefferson is talking about, it was something that was a very real option at the time, the notion of the government in one way or another promoting a certain religion, maybe even not really suppressing, but certainly making it illegal to say certain things, to profess atheism, for instance, but also to clearly adjudicate or to favor or to promote some religions over others. And we'll see when we talk about the First Amendment, that's one of the things that under the First Amendment, especially as it's been interpreted in the past 100 years or so, one thing you cannot do is promote a religion. You obviously can't suppress individual religions. You also can't indirectly do it by promoting a religion. So let's start with his arguments. And in the Notes on the State of Virginia, that discussion of religious freedom, it's a really, in case you haven't noticed, Jefferson is a great writer. He goes through it not only eloquently, but very, very concisely with great economy of expression, and step by step says, okay, here's my argument, but I'll grant you this. Then here's what I would say in response, okay? So let's go through and look at his arguments in this part of Notes on the State of Virginia, okay? He begins by saying, why do we need freedom of religion? Because freedom of conscience, the right to believe what you think is true and not to have to worry about the government trying to figure out what you think or interfering with your ability to believe what you think is true, he says that's a fundamental natural right. We see natural rights to life, liberty, and property. In some ways, the most important is the freedom of conscience, the freedom to figure out for yourself what you believe is true, and then to believe or not based on, because based on your own judgment and your own sense of what is true, because it's very difficult, obviously, to believe something that you think for good reason is not true, okay? So he says, begins with the idea of freedom of conscience is a natural right. He says, our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted, could never submit. We are answerable for them to our God. So even if somebody compels you to profess a particular belief that you don't really believe, that's an unjust or an illegitimate compulsion. Obviously, people can be forced to say things that they don't really believe, to profess religions, to renounce religions in ways where they don't really believe what they're saying. But Jefferson is saying you can never justly, legitimately renounce your freedom of conscience and let the government decide for you what the truth about God or religion or anything is. You can accept that you have to obey certain laws if they're good laws, but you can never really renounce that freedom of conscience, that simple fact that what you believe is ultimately a matter of your own conscience. And what you believe is true and what you believe is good, those things ultimately are directly down to your own conscience. And you can't really, even if you wanted to, you can't hand that freedom over to the government. You can't give the government the authority or the ability to understand, to figure those things out for you, to make those arguments, to make those decisions for you. And if the government tries to take them, if the government tries to take that power from you and force you, Jefferson says that's never going to be a legitimate use of government power. That is not a natural right, the freedom of conscience, that we can possibly give away. Okay, the rights of conscience, the rights to believe and then to act as we believe is right, within limits, obviously, within limits of certain destructiveness or whatever, but the right to believe what you think is true and then to act as your conscience dictates based on those beliefs, Jefferson says we can't give those up to the government. And specifically what he's probably thinking about here is not so much overthrowing the government as a right of conscience, but practicing religion or not practicing religion the way that you think is right. Okay, so he begins by saying these are natural rights. We cannot give them up to the government. Okay, so any attempt by the government to take them, to tell us that we cannot practice this religion or that we cannot publicly express these ideas about God or about whatever, these things are things we can't give up. We are ultimately answerable for them only to God, and the government cannot interfere with this. Okay, so he begins by saying fundamental natural right, we cannot give it up. But then he also says, related to that, very closely related to that, the government only needs to deal with material interests, okay? Things like physical safety and property. The government's realm is not belief, it's material interest, it's physical well-being and physical prosperity, okay? So he says this fairly famous quote, the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So again, the idea that why does government exist? What are its legitimate, real interests? What does it need to deal with? Physical safety and property. Belief is not something for government to deal with. And this is something that we'll come back to again and again, okay? Government deals with, again, physical things, material interests, safety, prosperity, property, a few other things like that. Belief, even if you find the belief shocking or upsetting, that's not a matter for the government. Okay, but let's say that you think that it is. Let's say that you think that actually the government can legitimately deal with religious belief and try to tell people or even coerce people, even say if you don't profess this, if you say this publicly, you will be put in jail, maybe even physically harmed. Okay, basically Jefferson says this doesn't make somebody better, even if you're willing to grant that the government could do that or should do that. He says it doesn't make somebody better, it actually makes them worse because it makes them a hypocrite. It makes them basically profess something that they don't really believe, and that's hypocrisy. So he says, as he puts it, constraint may make him worse by making him a hypocrite, but it will never make him a truer man. It may fix him obstinately in his errors, but will not cure them. So what does it actually do if the government tries to tell you, you need to believe this or else you're going to jail or else you're being even tortured, even killed? Well, let's keep it simple. You're going to be fined. You're going to have to pay an extra tax if you profess this, if you're a member of this religion rather than this one. You're not allowed to publicly say these certain things. You're not allowed to publicly profess atheism or certain other ideas. What does that do? And if you do, let's just say you have to pay a fine. Let's keep it relatively low stakes. Jefferson says, is that going to make somebody truer? If they are wrong, do you make them better by coercing them to profess something, to publicly state that they believe something that they don't really? No, he says that makes them worse. It makes them a hypocrite. Or when threatened, people may double down. They might say, you know what, I am not giving in because I'm being threatened. So as he puts it, it may fix somebody obstinately in their errors because they refuse to give in to coercion. It doesn't cure them. It doesn't make them, as he puts it, it doesn't make someone, as Jefferson puts it, a truer man. Okay, you're not going to make them, and here the view of virtue and of the purpose of freedom of conscience is relatively clear, right? The point is not just to profess things that are true or to be, to have beliefs, or at least to be allowed to publicly profess beliefs that are socially harmonious or helpful in some way. It is actually, you should be true. When you say something, it should be something that you genuinely believe, and you shouldn't try to force belief. You could get in here and you could debate and you could question, is this always how belief works? Does professing something that you don't fully believe but trying, does that make a difference? But even then, that begins from an action, that begins from the act of wanting to believe, of trying to believe something that you think is good or true, even if you can't fully believe it. Whereas Jefferson says pure constraint, somebody being forced through some sort of threat or another to say something, to pretend to believe something, it's not going to make them truer. It's going to make them a hypocrite, or it's going to make them resistant, and they're going to resist because they feel like they are not going to give in to coercion. Okay, so that's an argument against coercion as well. Natural rights, can't give them up. That's not the purpose of government anyways. The government should deal with things like keeping us safe and maybe regulating property. Constraint and coercion, even if you think the government can or should do that, it's not going to make somebody worse. So if the point of this is to make people work better, using governmental constraint to make them profess something or believe something, it's not going to work. It's actually going to make them a worse person. And then he goes on, and then this is kind of the more positive view, the power of truth and reason, okay? As he puts it, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. In other words, not government coercion, not suppression, but reason and free inquiry. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal, to the test of their investigation. They are the natural enemies of error and of error only. Reason and experiment have been indulged, and error has fled before them. It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself, okay? So he's saying that reason, experiment, some of the other states of the time, more freedom of religion was allowed than had been granted in the state of Virginia at that point. And he says error has fled before them. As he puts it, error alone, false beliefs alone need the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Fundamental Enlightenment belief here that if you let people think for themselves, if you let them investigate freely, they will arrive at the truth, okay? And that's obviously a pretty fundamental part of democracy, right? That the people can figure things out. And again, very clear how this is expressed in the First Amendment, okay? So there's then this further positive view that, you know, if you want people to be better, allow them to debate freely and they will arrive at the truth. You don't have to pressure or coerce or threaten somebody into believing the truth. Just show them why it's true. They'll be able to figure it out. Even if you disagree in principle, even if you think, no, I don't think that they will, I think that people need to be brought to the truth, sometimes unwillingly, and you can't really trust people to figure it out. Okay, even if you disagree in principle with that, who will wield this power? Okay, this is what Jefferson goes on to argue. Subject opinion to coercion. In other words, allow people's opinion to be a subject for government investigation and coercion. Whom will you make your inquisitors? Fallible men, men governed by bad passions, by private as well as public reasons. So even if in theory you think the government should serve this role or this purpose, who is actually going to be doing that? As he puts it, fallible men, men governed by bad passions, by private reasons, people who will find reasons to use this power to attack enemies or to benefit themselves in some ways, as well as by public reasons, okay? So it's also bad policy. It's basically not going to work, okay? Moreover, but let's say you think that it can. Let's think that all these things can happen and you actually disagree with all of his premises so far. Then he argues against the idea of uniformity of opinion. So he says, why subjected opinion investigation to coercion to produce uniformity? But is uniformity of opinion desirable? No more than of face and stature. Difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. The several sects perform the office of a censor morum over each other. In other words, if there's one religion and it's supported by the government and no one is really allowed to question it, and that religion is full of corruption, who will be able to point that out? Nobody, because no one can challenge the religion, maybe for good reasons, maybe because you think that it's true and you don't want people spreading error or attacking a true religion or true beliefs, but the result is going to be that nobody can question obvious abuses. Okay, when there are multiple religions, when there's religious diversity or pluralism, the religions necessarily kind of, you know, hopefully it doesn't descend into pure sectarian bickering all the time and finger pointing and attacks, but they do kind of watch each other. And there's a censor morum, they kind of watch each other for corruption. And if it happens, hopefully they are somewhat more, again, without becoming tiresome and overly quarrelsome and whatnot, they may be pointed out. So he says uniformity of opinion isn't desirable. You want some diversity in order to keep people honest. Because even if you believe that something is obviously every religion, even if you think it's true, is subject to some corruption, is subject to some people having power or influence who are not going to use it for good reasons. Then he goes on and says, is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned, yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. So again, even if you don't believe what he said earlier, even if you say, no, uniformity of opinion is good, if something is true, everybody should believe it. Certainly a little bit of corruption in the true church is better than people wandering and not knowing what the truth is, or falling prey to false prophets or false churches or whatever, false beliefs of whatever sort. Okay, let's say that you think that. Let's say that you think that the government can do this and it's important that everybody have uniformity. Is it attainable? He says, no, let's look at history. We've seen all of these attempts, you know, again, not just to find people, to imprison them, but also to torture them, to kill them. And we're no closer. In fact, we're less close to uniformity in Jefferson's day when that was all, you know, some of it was still happening and was certainly within very recent memory. They're no closer to uniformity than they ever were. what has been the effect of coercion? To make one half the world fools and the other half hypocrites. So again, to coerce some people to believe things, because again, if you're going to have coercion, untrue, false churches, untrue beliefs are going to use it as well. So what has been the effect of coercion? Half the world is fools because they've been forced into believing something that isn't true. They haven't been able to hear it challenged or hear other ideas. The other half are hypocrites because they've chosen to believe things, or they've professed things only under threat of violence or punishment. Okay, so uniformity not attainable. So first he says, is uniformity attainable? Is it desirable? He says no. But even if you think that it is, and you could make an argument that if you know what the truth is, everybody should believe it. It's not actually good to let people believe things that you know are false. Is it attainable? Is it attainable through government coercion? And he says, no, it's not. And in fact, again, trying to use coercion to bring everybody to the truth has the opposite result. It has a worse result. It makes half the world fools, the other half hypocrites. Okay, so again, even if you know the true religion, even if you're convinced that this is the true religion, what are you going to do, especially across the world? Even in the United States at the time, when there was a fairly high level of religious diversity, but especially across the world, here he kind of broadens the scope, maybe in part to make his argument a little bit stronger. So let's say we have the true religion. Let's say that one religion is true and we can see what it is. Even if our religion is the one true out of 1,000 practiced on the earth, as he puts it, we should wish to see the 999 wandering sects gathered into the fold of truth. So again, if we know the true religion, obviously we want all the false ones, we want them to be gathered into the fold of truth, as he puts it. And this has obviously religious implications, but this could go, again, for any set of beliefs, right? If people believe something, which in some cases might be much easier to tell is untrue than in questions of religious disagreement, you want them gathered into the fold of truth, right? You don't want to be totally indifferent to somebody who believes something that's clearly untrue and possibly very bad for them, okay? So you want to see people who are in error, again, to use his phrase, gathered into the fold of truth. But again, such a majority, we cannot affect this by force. Reason and persuasion are the only practicable instruments. So against, especially globally, against all of these other beliefs, all these other ideas, we can't hope to bring them all into the fold of truth by force or by coercion. Reason, persuasion, that's the only real option we have. Okay, then he goes, so that's basically what he says in the selection on Notes on the State of Virginia on religious freedom. And then this bill for establishing religious freedom, very short, again, very dense, it says a lot of important things, very, very clearly, very concisely. Okay, so this is the argument against establishment. So that was kind of against coercion. Now here's the argument against establishment, meaning the government choosing a religion and promoting it in some way. And this is kind of what the British government was doing at the time, and still does in a very low-key way. But basically pick a religion and then promote it. So now there was also obviously these two things can go together. You can have establishment and the promotion of a particular church along with suppression of other churches, and that certainly happened in British and English history. But even if you set aside coercion, right, a kind of a more gentle way of doing this is what's called establishment, establishing a religion like the Church of England, and then the government promotes it. And so basically and also it may be in a very subtle way, people are excluded from certain political and even social, but you can't always make that a matter of law. So maybe they're excluded from certain political opportunities if they're not a member of, say, the Church of England, if they're not a member of the established church. Okay, so this is less about actual coercion, trying to suppress things or punishing people for what they say that deviates, and more just saying you can say whatever you want to, but here's the official religion. And if you want a high position in government, you need to be a member of this church. Meanwhile, anybody can say, they can believe, they can practice how they want, but here's our established church, and this is going to have certain advantages, including government support, right? So the churches might be nicer, the ministers might be paid more. All kinds of advantages like that, okay? So here are his arguments against that, against establishment. And again, this is something that we see very clearly in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, which we'll talk about. So one of the arguments that it tends also to corrupt the principles of that very religion it is meant to encourage by bribing with a monopoly of worldly honors and emoluments those who will externally profess and conform to it. So the first thing he says is it corrupts that religion. When you're trying to promote a religion by saying, as he puts it, a monopoly of worldly honors and emoluments, who is actually, first of all, the people who are already there, who might begin by believing sincerely, are going to be corrupted by that. They are going to, it's going to be very difficult for many of them to ignore those worldly honors and emoluments, payments, privileges. And of course, it's also going to draw people in who are joining just for that reason. And that was tactically, that was part of the reason for establishment, is to lessen the disagreement and to lessen the conflict over religion by saying every ambitious person maybe can just join the official church. And then if that's what you want, if you want political power, if you want these other things, you can just join this church and then you'll be a member. And then we don't necessarily have to worry so much about these smaller churches that, you know, are going to be drained of all of the ambitious people who basically want to use religion as a vehicle for worldly ambition and worldly accomplishment. But of course, then that corrupts that church or that religion, as well as the people who, again, might begin believing sincerely. It's going to be very difficult for them not to be somewhat influenced by that and corrupted, and to come to care a little bit too much about these worldly honors, which are now their own monopoly, right? Again, he comes back to this idea that the opinions of men are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. Again, the opinions of people, their beliefs, that is not the object of civil government. That is not under the jurisdiction of civil government. Civil government, again, exists for physical things, material things, safety, prosperity, regulating property, things like that, not opinions, not beliefs. Not the object of civil government, and it's not under their jurisdiction. They should not do anything to try to promote or discourage any particular set of beliefs. It goes on and says that it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. So in other words, some religions, some beliefs might be dangerous. They may actually lead people to be dangerous, violent, to as he puts it here, break out into overt acts against peace and good order, and you can deal with it then. But until then, you don't need to worry about it, and you don't need to try to, again, as we see, coerce, but also just, you know, try to promote one, to try to establish a religion to deal with this, okay? And finally, the truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. So again, it comes back to this belief, truth is great, will prevail if left to herself. The only error alone needs the support of the government. Comes back to this idea that if you let people investigate and debate freely, they will arrive at the truth. You don't need the government to try to discourage or promote a certain set of truths. People will figure that out, okay? And so there's that basic fundamental Enlightenment belief, very important, that again, free inquiry will lead everybody, or at least most people, to the truth. More recently, you may question that as society became larger, more complicated. Jefferson was not an opponent of the Constitution like the Anti-Federalists. He was not as involved in the debates, as directly involved in the debates over the Constitution, publicly involved as the Anti-Federalists. But he shared some of their ideas, their preference for localism and local government where possible, his belief that kind of smaller levels of organization and self-government would be better. So as society becomes more complicated and people rely more on mass media, you might start to question some of these things, right? First of all, things do become kind of out of the reach of the ordinary person. Things become more complicated. But also the means of communication, and of communicating these things becomes also in a way more diffuse, but also more concentrated. Because on the one hand, you have maybe a newspaper or a broadcast or a website eventually that reaches the entire country and maybe millions of people. On the other hand, it may be controlled in some ways, owned, and in some ways controlled or at least influenced by a very small number of people. So the ability to manipulate public opinion becomes an issue as you get into the 19th and certainly the 20th and 21st century. And there's a lot of debate and a lot of concern and a lot of analysis about that. And that's one of the things you may question. Obviously, we see it now with fake news, cable news, which is sensationalist and often very misleading and not quite disinformation, but not exactly good information. Certainly hard to imagine that that's what Jefferson had in mind when he's talking about these things. And then, of course, with the internet and social media and the ability of literal things that just aren't true, the way that people just kind of lap them up and believe them in some cases, as well as the ability to, again, people to kind of choose something that fits with what they want to believe, It may not be literally untrue the way that some things are, but is very partial, very dishonest, inaccurate. Again, misinformation, sometimes disinformation, the attempt to positively tell people things that aren't true. But again, the ability of people to pick and choose half-truths in order to suit what they want to believe for whatever reasons. There are certainly questions about, at this point, about whether Jefferson was right, but they're not questions that have been clearly answered in the negative. So these ideas are certainly here. Again, they certainly underlie the Constitution, the First Amendment in particular, but so many aspects of our society, our laws, also our political culture, our assumptions about how people should act, what is, reasonable for government to do and not. They're up for question, but again, it's, I think, very much an open question, a genuinely open question.